everyone, welcome back to this video lecture series for Introduction to Philosophy. In our last video, you'll recall that I ended by making some points about the method of philosophy. Specifically, I said that the way philosophers go about doing their business, answering philosophical questions, is through a process called argument. And the main point I wanted to make in the previous video was less about the technical points about argumentation, and more about the attitude or disposition that one should bring to a philosophical argument, or really an argument of any kind. And there I argued that instead of seeing argument as an avenue or way to win, instead of seeing victory as the purpose of engaging in argument, one ought to see pursuit of the truth as the nature or purpose or function of argument. So in this video, now that we have a sort of general structure about what we should be doing when we argue, I want to go through some of the finer, more detailed points about argument and give you a sense of how arguments are structured and how they work in philosophy. So the first thing I want to do, let's begin with a more precise definition of what an argument is. So an argument is simply a set of statements in which one statement, which we'll call the conclusion, is inferred from another set of statements, which we call the premises. Now, there's a really important word in that definition, namely the concept of inference. What does it mean to infer one thing from another? Well, this is what we mean by inference. An inference is drawn when one concludes that because some set of statements, like P1, P2, P3, etc., is true, so because some set or group of statements is true, then some other statement C is also true. Another way of thinking about this is that if that set, P1, P2, and P3 are all true, then C must be true as well. So in an argument, we have a situation where we said the conclusion is inferred from the premises, and you can think of it this way. If you add all the premises up, all those statements together imply that C must be true, that the conclusion must be true, so the conclusion is inferred from the premises. Okay, so to make this a little more concrete, let's look at a simple example of an argument. We'll call this argument 1. So here's the way this reasoning goes. If tuition is raised even the slightest amount, then the students will feel angry and resentful. If students feel angry and resentful, then they will stage a violent takeover of the campus tomorrow, causing a great deal of death and destruction. Therefore, tomorrow will be a peaceful day on campus. Now, the first thing I'll say about this argument is that the reason I chose it is because just how bad it is. In fact, as I'm going to show you, this argument fails as a good argument in pretty much every way that an argument can fail. So it's not so much a example for emulation as it is a cause for caution. Here's an example of what not to do in an argument. So let's think about what is wrong with this argument. Why is this such a bad argument? And to get a better sense of this, let's first break down its structure a little further. In this argument, we have two statements, 1 and 2, which are functioning as premises, from which a third statement, a conclusion, is inferred. So the statement, tomorrow will be a peaceful day on campus, is inferred by the statements, if tuition is raised even the slightest amount, the students will feel angry and resentful, and if they feel angry and resentful, they'll stage a violent takeover of campus tomorrow. So the idea behind the argument is that because 1 and 2 are true, therefore we should also believe that 3 is true. And how do we know what the premises are, what the conclusion is? How do we know which way the inference is going? Well, it's not always so clear in every argument you'll look at an actual piece of philosophical writing or any other writing for that matter. But in this case, it actually is pretty clear. One reason for that is because we have this word therefore, which functions as a conclusion or argument indicator. So therefore is telling you, because these previous statements 1 and 2 are true, we know that 3 is true as well. Okay, so first that's the structure of the inference. Now, let's think to ourselves, well, what are all the problems with this argument? Why is it a bad argument? Why, in fact, does it fail? Well, there's a number of reasons. The first error, let's just look at statement 1 in isolation. If tuition is raised even the slightest amount, then the students will feel angry and resentful. Now, look, I have no doubt that tuition raises do justifiably, in times, cause students to feel angry and resentful. That's, of course, a phenomenon that happens. But as this statement is put, it doesn't seem likely that this is true, right? There's some amount you could raise tuition by which wouldn't cause anger and resentment. You could probably even raise tuition by a penny, and the vast majority of students wouldn't even notice. So first, one problem with this argument is that the first premise, the first statement used here, is false. Slight tuition raises are not necessarily going to cause students to feel angry and resentful. So that's one big problem. Second, let's look at statement 2 in isolation. If the students feel angry and resentful, then they'll stage a violent takeover of the campus tomorrow, causing a great deal of death and destruction. Well, again, it is true that in some cases, anger and resentment can lead to violent takeovers causing death and destruction. But not always. I mean, many people feel angry and resentful and don't do anything about it. They just brood in their sorrow. So this statement doesn't necessarily seem to be true either. When we look at it in isolation, I would need a little more evidence to think that this is actually the case. So the first thing to say about this argument is that both of the premises, both of the statements which are used as evidence to show that the conclusion 3 is true, both of those are false. The evidence used by the argument seems bad, and that's a significant error in argument. But in fact, the problems don't actually stop there. I want you to think, despite the criticisms that we've made of 1 and 2, just imagine in your mind, just assume for the sake of argument, that 1 and 2 are true. Right? I've just told you that 1 and 2 are bad evidence for 3, but put that aside. Let's say that 1 and 2 were true. Now ask the following question. Are 1 and 2 enough to get you to 3? Even if 1 and 2 are true, is that actually enough to show that the conclusion, tomorrow will be a peaceful day on campus, is true? And before we evaluate that, notice now I'm not looking at these statements themselves. I'm not looking at statement 1, I'm not looking at statement 2. I'm looking at the movement or the inference from 1 and 2 to 3. I'm looking at the therefore, you might say. Is this a good inference or a bad inference? Now the first thing you might notice here is that this seems like not the right inference to make at all. Because if it's really true that a slight tuition increase will cause students to feel angry and resentful, and if it's true that anger and resentment will cause death and destruction and violent takeover of campus, then we wouldn't expect 3, tomorrow will be a peaceful day on campus. In fact, we would expect the exact opposite. You would say, if 1 and 2 are true, then the conclusion should read, tomorrow will be a very violent day on campus. So this doesn't seem like a very good inference at all. 1 and 2 don't get you to 3, they get you to the opposite of 3. And the problems don't even stop there. Because let's say the conclusion said, tomorrow will be a violent day on campus. Well, are 1 and 2 enough to get you to that conclusion yet? Well, no, not really. 1 says if tuition is raised, students will feel angry. 2 says if the students are angry, they'll stage a violent takeover of campus. But we still don't even have, the argument still doesn't even claim that tuition was raised. At this point, the argument just paints a hypothetical picture where we imagine tuition being raised and the consequence is a violent takeover of campus. But unless there was a third premise saying that tuition actually is raised, we can't conclude anything just from that hypothetical scenario we painted in our head. So there's a further reason why the inference fails. 1 and 2 simply are not enough to get to 3. Okay, so that pretty much exhausts the errors of the argument, and not only does it exhaust the errors of this argument, it shows that this argument fails in essentially every way an argument can fail. And I divide the sort of errors in reasoning you might find in an argument into two types. So first, there's what I'll call an error of evidence. And an argument commits an error of evidence when the reasons or premises it gives to establish its conclusion are false or unsubstantiated. So we saw this. We were like, both 1 and 2 seem very likely to be false. That doesn't seem like solid evidence. I would say those premises are not true. So it commits an error of evidence insofar as those premises are incorrect. So that's one kind of error. Is the evidence good or is the evidence bad? But there's a second kind of error as well. And this is what I call an error of inference. And an argument commits an error of inference when the reasons or premises it employs, even if they were true, are insufficient to support the conclusion. Right, so what do we mean here? Well, again, remember when I told you to imagine. Imagine that 1 is true. Imagine that 2 is true. We said that still wasn't enough to get you all the way to the conclusion, all the way to statement 3 in the argument. Even if the evidence were good, you still wouldn't have shown what you're trying to establish. Why is that? Because the inference is bad. The underlying logical structure of the argument is bad. The evidence doesn't get you the conclusion. And so not only does this argument commit an error of evidence, it also commits an error of inference. And so again, like I said, this argument goes wrong and goes bad in every way an argument can. Okay. So, before we leave this rather simple argument, there's one other point I want to make. At many times in this class, I'm going to take the reasoning and the argument that we'll find in our readings, and I'm going to put it in sort of a standard premise-conclusion format. So originally when I displayed the argument too, I did it in this fashion, in just a normal sort of prose paragraph format. In order to make arguments easier to evaluate when we start talking about philosophy, we often put them in this format. Right, so what have I done here? P1, P2, C. I've taken, P1 stands for premise 1, P2 stands for premise 2, C stands for conclusion. So I've taken the statements which are the premises 1 and 2, given them their own separate lines, taken the statement 3, which is the conclusion, given its own separate line. And you'll see me do this all the time, right? And so on these outline documents that I use for the lectures, I'll be outlining philosophical reasoning in this way. And what is the advantage of doing so? Why is this a good idea? Why is it a good thing to do? Well, the main reason is the following. When you're evaluating a philosophical argument, you're asking yourself, is this a good argument or a bad argument? Putting in this format allows you to sort of organize your thoughts and better determine whether you think the argument succeeds. So for instance, if you want to reject this argument, right, then you have the premises outlined. You can ask yourself the question, let me focus just on P1. Do I think P1 is true? Now let me focus on P2. Do I think P2 is true? And if you're worried about an error of inference, you can ask yourself, do P1 and P2 lead to C? So putting the argument in this format just lays it out a little more clearly, allows you to organize your thoughts, and determine whether you think the premises are true or false. In the vast majority of cases, when you have a philosophical argument, to show that the argument goes wrong, you just need to reject one of the premises. Now, if more than one premise is false, you can certainly point that out as well. But if one of these premises in the argument is not true, the argument will fail because all the premises are supposed to be needed to get to the conclusion. At least in the majority of cases. Okay, so let's leave argument 1 behind and let's look at a little more sophisticated philosophical argument. And this argument is one of the classic philosophical arguments for the existence of God. It's one version of what's known as the design argument for the existence of God. And it comes from this famous work called Natural Theology that was published in 1802 by this philosopher named William Paley. And in that argument, he uses the following comparison, the following analogy. So I'll read this passage and then we'll outline the reasoning, and then I want to invite you to think more about this argument. So here's Paley. He says, in crossing a heath, suppose I pitch my foot against a stone, and we're asked how the stone came to be there. I might possibly answer that, for anything I knew to the contrary, it had lain there forever. Nor would it perhaps be very easy to show the absurdity of this answer. Okay, so Paley says, let's say, I'm walking along, I come across a stone, it hits against my foot, I look down, and I just I'm in a particularly reflective mood at the time, so I ask myself, where did this stone come from? Okay, now, he thinks to himself, he's like, yeah, someone might have deliberately constructed it or put it there, but it would be a perfectly reasonable conclusion to think that it maybe just always existed. It just came about by chance, and as long as the earth had been around, that stone had just been there. That'd be a perfectly reasonable conclusion. But then he compares that situation to the following scenario. But suppose I had found a watch upon the ground, and it should be inquired how the watch happened to be in that place. I should hardly think of the answer which I had before given, that for anything I knew, the watch might have always been there. Okay, so he's walking along just like before, he sees this watch on the ground, and think about what it means to see a watch on the ground. So you see an object which has all these minute, intricate parts that are put together specifically for a certain purpose. What is that purpose? To tell time. Okay, so you have this watch on the ground, and you think to yourself, where did this watch come from? Now, could it have just existed there forever like the stone? Could it just have come together by chance through random actions of atoms and have been there forever? Well, it's possible. But it seems very unlikely. Like, what would be the chances that all those little parts came together in just the right way to allow this machine to tell time? After all, if you have something like a watch, if just one part or maybe a few parts are out of place, the whole thing won't work. So it seems very unlikely that this could have just arisen by chance. So Paley says, no, in the case of the watch, we can't imagine it was just chance. It would have to be something like what he calls an intelligent designer. There must have been some human being, or multiple human beings, who put that object together in a specific way for a specific purpose. Okay, so this is the basic analogy he uses. And you ask, well, how does this get us to an argument for the existence of God? That all seems right. What is the rest of the argument? Now, there's more to, this is just one passage from this chapter in natural theology. There's more argumentation, which we're not going to go through. I'm just going to cut to the chase and give you essentially the argument he goes on to make. I'm going to call this Paley's Watchmaker Argument. So first, premise 1. Anything that has multiple parts carefully coordinated to achieve some valuable purpose must be the product of an intelligent designer. This is the point he was making with the watch. Many little parts, put together in a certain way to achieve a purpose of value, telling time. Well, it couldn't just be chance, it must be an intelligent designer. Okay, then he adds a second premise, P2. The human eye, and the human eye is just an example for him. There's many other natural objects you could choose in nature, but the human eye and other natural purposive objects, they have multiple parts that are carefully coordinated to achieve a valuable purpose. Think about your eye. Just like the watch has all sorts of tiny little parts that had to be put together in a certain way in order to allow you to see and have conscious awareness of that experience. So, conclusion 1, the human eye and other natural purposive objects must be the product of an intelligent designer. He says, well, look, when we come across our eye, of course we don't come across an eye as we do, you might find a watch on the ground, but when we think about our eyes and many other, natural biological forms of life, it would be unreasonable to think they just came about through chance. How could that be possible? They're not like the stone, they're more like the watch, which has multiple parts coming together for a certain purpose. And so the first conclusion he draws is that the human eye must be the product of an intelligent designer. Now, before I move on to the rest of the argument, I want to make a comment about the overall structure of this argument. You'll see I've divided it into inference 1 and inference 2. Well, what's going on here? Well, the part of the argument I've gone over so far is just this first part. And in this first part, we see premise 1 and premise 2 coming together to give us conclusion 1. That's the first inference. But not all arguments have to stop there. Argument 1 just had 2 premises and a conclusion, but many arguments can go further, and this one does. In this argument, there are 2 inferences. First, P1 and P2 give us conclusion 1. And then, once we have conclusion 1, once we know the human eye must be the product of an intelligent designer, we can then use this claim as a premise to get a further conclusion. You can think of C1 as sort of an intermediate stop on the way to your final conclusion. You say, okay, now we've shown that C1 is true. What else can this allow us to show? And so the second inference, we have conclusion 1 and a third premise giving us our final conclusion, C2 or conclusion 2. Many philosophical arguments will be like this. You first establish one conclusion, you use that conclusion as a further piece of evidence to make your final conclusion. Alright, so let's take a look at how the rest of the argument works. So now we know, according to Paley's argument, that the human eye must be the product of an intelligent designer. Premise 3. The human eye has, and other natural purposive objects have, a much higher degree of excellence than artificial purposive objects, like a watch. So compare the human eye and the watch. Now, the watch is a marvelous thing. It took a lot of ingenuity and creativity to make and perfect, and it, of course, allows us to do something valuable, which is keep track of time. But compare it to the eye. Think of just how profound, just think how complex something must be to literally allow us to have visual perception and experience of the world. One can make a credible argument that the human eye is much more excellent than merely a watch. So what is that? If that's true, what does that tell us? Well, the conclusion that Paley ultimately wants to draw is that, look, when it comes to a watch, we can just say a human made it. But what do we have to say about the eye? Something that seems much more excellent, much more intricate than a watch. Paley thinks the only explanation is that the intelligent designer of the human eye must be God. And why is this? Well, God is seen as a much more excellent, all-powerful, all-knowing being. Also seen as the originator or creator of the universe, according to many religious traditions. So Paley says it seems like a good candidate for what the intelligent designer of the human eye and other natural objects is. So, to wrap up the structure of the argument, first Paley says we show that natural objects like the human eye have an intelligent designer. Then we give a further reason in P3 to think that this intelligent designer is God. Okay, so why do we go through this argument? Well, first, it just gives you an example of what philosophical reasoning looks like. And as we move through the course material, you'll get much more familiar, much more used to seeing arguments in this format. But it also gives us a good opportunity to evaluate Paley's reasoning. So, and again, I want you to, when you think about evaluating this argument, and one of your discussion questions for this week gives you the opportunity to evaluate whether you think this is a good argument or not. When you're evaluating the argument, ask yourself the questions we talked about before. Is there an error of evidence? And is there an error of inference? Okay, well, what do I mean? Well, look carefully at the premises. Look at P1. Do you think that anything with multiple parts carefully coordinated to achieve a valuable purpose must be the product of an intelligent designer? Or is it possible that things with lots of parts that serve a specific purpose could come about by chance? Is there something in between design and chance that might explain how such things come about? Is it true that natural objects like the human eye have many parts coordinated for a valuable purpose? And P3, is it true that the human eye is much more excellent than artificial purposive objects? Can you think of some artificial, human-made objects that you might say are even more excellent than natural objects? Can you think of some natural objects that maybe aren't all that great? And then, so those are questions you're asking when you're looking at the premises. You're asking, is there an error of evidence? But also ask about, is there an error of inference? Are the reasons, is the evidence given in this argument enough to get to the final conclusion? And there I would really invite you to focus on the inference to the final conclusion. Paley says, well look, if we think the human eye is a product of intelligent design, and if we think that the human eye is much more excellent than other sorts of, artificial objects like the watch, then the intelligent designer must be God. Right, he says, if we agree that the human eye and other natural objects have an intelligent designer, then that intelligent designer must be God. That must be what we're talking about. But you might say, are there other possibilities? Are there other things besides God that could be that intelligent designer? Now, as you think about this, I just want to leave you with one other thought. This argument was, of course, published in 1802. Now, in the year 2020, of course, we have the benefit of biological science, of the theory of evolution by natural selection. And for that reason, contemporary biologists would not be so impressed with P1. They would say, yes, of course, natural objects like the human eye have multiple parts for a specific purpose, but we can explain that through evolution by natural selection. We don't need an intelligent designer. It's one of the big reasons this specific argument isn't so convincing today. Now, there are other forms of the design argument sort of inspired by Paley's, which aren't taken down by evolution. But this particular one, in the way it's outlined, evolution does essentially give us very good reason to think P1 is false. But just as an intellectual exercise, I want you to put yourself back into 1802. I want you to see what you think about the argument before we knew about evolution by natural selection, because of course that is the context that Paley was in. And I want you to ask yourself, even if we put aside the theory of evolution by natural selection, are there still some reasons we might question this argument? Are there reasons we might think that P1, P2, or P3 could be false still? And even if all these claims are true, does that really get us all the way to God? Okay, so I'll stop there. I'll be interested and curious to see what you think. And as always, thank you for watching. I will see you in the next video.